One of the great things that the internet has given us is YouTube, specifically the cornucopia of channels filled with interesting and instructive videos. One of my favorite is by Matt Parker, a mathematics instructor at Queen Mary University in London and a stand-up comic. His channel, Standup Maths, presents highly complex mathematical concepts in a fun and funny way that makes them so that anyone, no matter how numerically challenged, can understand them. I highly recommend that you check out his YouTube channel, and you can see him do things like estimate pi by weighing a circle, and watch as he derives the function of Broadway in New York City. Now recently, Matt did a video about this number, 29.97. That's the frame rate of analog television in North America, and one of the many frame rates available in high-definition television. He goes into the mathematical underpinnings of this rather unusual number, and he does an excellent job of showing how the various numerical values of American television were derived. How, after all, television is mathematics expressed as dots on a screen. However, he went completely off the rails when he said this.
This system of broadcast is called NTSC, and it was put in place in the 1950s by the National Television Systems Committee. And so now you know what NTSC stands for. It stands for not the smartest choice.
Oh, Matt, you were doing so well. Look, it's a long-standing tradition among broadcast types to give snarky backronyms to the various color standards. The European system, PAL, or phase alternate line, gets turned into pretty awful looking, which isn't very fair, and paying for all that luxury, which kind of is. The system developed by the French and the Soviet Union, SECAM, or SEquentiel Couleur of Mémoire, gets turned into system essentially contrary to the American method, which, considering its origins, is dead on accurate. However, calling NTSC not the smartest choice is very unfair, and to properly defend it, we need to go into some history that was beyond the purview of Matt's mathematical discourse. Once you examine that history, we'll see that NTSC was a product of its time, a compromise that averted a technological debacle of gargantuan proportions and allowed for almost 3/4 of a century of innovation. Okay, Sherman. Set the Wayback Machine for 1940. The Federal Communications Commission is preparing to allow American radio networks to blaze new frontiers in the exciting new medium, television. Television has been under development for decades, and it is now ready to make the leap from the laboratory to the living room. All that was needed was for a unified standard to be set up to allow all the sets nationwide to receive broadcasts. The year before, RCA had demonstrated a 441-line system at the New York World's Fair. However, there were other players in that field. Dumont and Philco were pushing for a higher resolution system. So the FCC created the National Television Standards Committee, and its purpose was to sort out all the competing interests and develop a common standard. The result of that committee's work was a recommendation for a monochrome system of 30 frames per second, 525 lines with 2 interlaced fields per frame. This system went into place in 1941, and on July 1st of that year, the world's first commercial television stations went on the air. WCBW in New York, licensed to the Columbia Broadcasting System on Channel 2, and WNBT, owned by RCA's National Broadcasting System, which eventually ended up on Channel 4, also in New York. Those stations are still on the air as the flagships of those networks, WCBS and WNBC. Further development on commercial television was delayed by America's entry into World War II. After the war, the players in the television game were anxious to put advances in electronics and telecommunications that were made during the war, such as access to the UHF band, to use in the quest to put television in every home. One of the things that had been out of reach before the war was color television, and now that advance was made possible by these new technologies. Both RCA and CBS wanted to establish systems they had developed. CBS showed a hybrid electronic and mechanical system that had been developed by their lead scientist, Dr. Peter Goldmark, who would later go on to develop the LP record. The CBS field sequential system sent each color, red, blue, and green, as separate fields and used a rotating color wheel spinning in front of the picture tube to reconstruct the color. In addition, it had a field rate of 144 Hz for an effective frame rate of 24 frames per second at 405 lines. It was completely incompatible with the existing monochrome system in almost every respect. So naturally, in 1950, the FCC said, "Okie dokie." Now, spoiler alert, the fact that we don't have massive color wheels rotating in front of our television sets every night gives away the ending here. The CBS system was not a success, and for 3 reasons. 1. The FCC had a freeze in place on new television station construction permits. The FCC was anticipating a larger demand for television than the pre-war plans had allowed for. So a freeze was put in place on the allocations until new frequencies, namely in the previously unusable UHF band, could be set aside. Also, the FCC wanted to use this freeze to study the color question a little better. 2, the Korean War was going on. The Office of Defense Mobilization put a hold on the manufacture of color television sets, arguing that the components and the materials that were needed for the sets were needed for the war effort. Finally, RCA sued the FCC to force them to reconsider their decision. These delays in the rollout of CBS's field sequential system enabled RCA to perfect their compatible color system, namely by implementing the 29.97 hack that Matt Parker explained. The FCC reconstituted the National Television Standards Committee to examine the issue of a color standard, and that resulted in the recommendation of the color standard that everyone, especially European broadcast types, loves to hate on. The first telecast using the new NTSC color system was made in December of 1953, and it remained in place in the United States until the mandatory shutdown of analog television here in February of 2009. Now sure, NTSC is a compromise. Yes, it has many flaws and imperfections, and yes, there are better ways to do color television if you start from scratch. But NTSC was the first color system, and it was the only one that was specifically designed to be backwards compatible with an existing system. Given those constraints, it's only natural that there will be things that don't work as well as possible, but it does work. And it avoided an even worse situation of having 2 totally incompatible television systems, which would have required broadcasters to provide 2 separate feeds of programming to 2 separate distribution and transmission networks. Take that and multiply it by CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox, and all the other networks, and you have a major logistical nightmare on your hands, not to mention a debacle that could kill the medium of television while it's still in its infancy. Sound ridiculous? Well, of course it does. No one in their right minds would ever willingly implement such an insane solution. Only it did happen. Twice in the same country, namely Matt Parker's home of the United Kingdom. Let me explain. To understand this, you need to go back a little bit further than we did before. In 1936, the British Broadcasting Corporation is back a little bit further than we did. World's first regularly scheduled high-definition television service. Now, their definition of high definition is a little different from ours today, but bear with me. There are 2 systems competing for the right to be the television standard for the UK. One is a mechanical system developed by a Scotsman named John Logie Baird. The other is an all-electronic system developed by Britain's EMI, or Electric and Musical Industries, called the Emitron. Baird's system used a spinning disc, not unlike the one that the CBS system would use. It was used to rasterize or break the image apart at the camera, and it was used on the receiver to reconstruct the image into a television picture. The Emitron used a specialized cathode ray tube to do this job. Another thing is, the Baird system provided a 240-line image, and EMI had a 405-line image. In November 1936, the BBC television service went on the air, alternating use of Baird's system with EMIs on successive nights. This went on for 3 months, until the 405-line EMI system was chosen and Baird's mechanical system given the boot. BBC television continued using the system until the Second World War broke out in September of 1939, when the channel went off the air. They returned in 1946 using the same system. The 405-line system, known internationally as ITU System A, was used to televise the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, introduced commercial television to the UK with ITV, and in 1963 introduced the world to a Time Lord and his stolen TARDIS. The BBC knew that their system was getting a little long in the tooth, and they saw the progress that the Americans were making with NTSC. So they commissioned tests to shoehorn color into the existing 405-line System A, using the NTSC color method, among others. The results were less than spectacular for one reason: bandwidth. The wider your channel, the more information you can transmit and the better your picture is going to be. In America, the 525-line system, designated ITU System M, has a channel width of 6 megahertz, with 4.5 megahertz of that being available for color. System A, being older, had a channel width of 5 megahertz, and only 3 of that was reserved for video. This had the effect of compounding the flaws in NTSC. British officials realized that an entirely new system would be required to accommodate color, so the decision was made to begin a switch over to the 625-line standard, called ITU System I, and put it up on UHF, where 8 megahertz channels could be allocated to the service. In 1964, BBC Two went on the air as a 625-line monochrome station, and color was added in 1967. BBC One and ITV followed in 1969. However, there were still millions of receivers in place that used the 405-line signal, and the UHF transmitter network didn't have the coverage of the VHF network. So those transmitters stayed on the air, duplicating BBC One and ITV programming until they finally went dark in 1985. That's right. The very situation that was averted by what is supposedly not the smartest choice existed in the United Kingdom for 21 years. Considering the technology of the time, the constraints and requirements placed upon it, and the massive insanity that it prevents, I'd say that NTSC really stands for, naturally, the safest compromise. It was that compromise that made possible satellite networks, video games, and microcomputers. If the CBS system had been left in place, those advances would have been much, much more difficult to implement. I'll be the first to admit that NTSC has its flaws, never the same color being an accurate, if succinct, description of them, but it was the first system. Of course, PAL and SECAM aren't going to have those faults. They saw the pitfalls of NTSC and specifically designed around them. Plus, they weren't trying to be shoehorned into an existing system. This introduced problems of their own, such as the inability of SECAM to cross-dissolve between two inputs, meaning that studio equipment at the television station has to operate in PAL or NTSC. But you see, that's what trailblazers do. They forge the path for the Johnny-come-latelys that follow. So there you go. More than you probably ever wanted to know about those old analog televisions that you got rid of 5 years ago when you got that shiny flat panel HD TV. Now, if you're still watching this, and I hope that you are, I think you'll like the topics that I'm going to be lining up for future episodes of Full Tilt Nerdity. So please subscribe to this channel and like this video, and leave your feedback in the notes below. So, until next time, stay nerdy.